Hello everyone and welcome to Law and Court Cases and another episode of my true crime series. In today's video we are going to be talking about the complicated case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard and the murder of DeeDee Blanchard. Although not the first case of Munchausen by proxy ever seen by the media, it could be arguably the most publicised. A sad and complex case that has so many factors. There is a lot to get into, so without further ado, let's hop into it. DeeDee Blanchard was born Claudine Petrie in Chack Bay, Louisiana, near the Gulf Coast in 1967, and grew up with her family in nearby Golden Meadow. She was one of 5 children. Relatives recalled that she had a habit of stealing from her family, which they speculated was a form of retaliation when things did not go her way. At some point in her early adult life, she worked as a nurse's aide. The family expressed suspicion that in 1997 she might have killed her own mother by denying her food. Proving already to be a deceptive young woman, it's not entirely surprising that the pattern of behaviour would continue. When she was 24, she became pregnant by Rob Blanchard, then 17. They named their daughter Gypsy Rose because DeeDee liked the name Gypsy and Rod was a fan of Guns N' Roses. Shortly before Gypsy's birth in July of 1991, the couple separated when Rod realised he got married for all the wrong reasons. DeeDee was not satisfied with this decision and tried her best to persuade Rod to reconsider. But despite her best efforts, he resisted, and in return she took her newborn daughter to live with her family. Rod was still very much involved in a young Gypsy's life despite this decision. It seemed to be going well. After all, they had a young healthy baby girl, and that was all that mattered. However, things would soon change, because it was when Gypsy was found about 3 months old that DeeDee first told Rod she was in fact sick. She believed the infant had sleep apnea and took her to the hospital. After monitoring and multiple overnight visits, the doctors at the hospital were confident in saying that there is not a case and the baby was in fact fine and free to go home. This should have been a relief to DeeDee, but she was convinced that something was still wrong with her daughter. Subsequently, DeeDee became convinced that Gypsy had a wide range of health issues, which she attributed to an unspecified chromosomal disorder, which she told Rod about. At another point, DeeDee claimed that Gypsy had muscular dystrophy and made her use a walker. Gypsy has said that when she was around 7 or 8 years of age, she was riding on her grandfather's motorcycle when they were involved in a minor incident, but DeeDee told Gypsy and others that the doctor at the hospital had given her a wheelchair that she was now required to use. At first glance, DeeDee probably came across as just a caring mother. Enough people heard of Gypsy's alleged ailments, and DeeDee told the story so well, people had no reason to question her. In the public eye, she came across as loving, and even Rod said that DeeDee was an extremely devoted mother to their sick daughter. The patterns of behaviour did not stop at home. Gypsy was led to believe that she was sick, and that her mother was the only one who really cared for her. Gypsy also seemed to have stopped going to school after the 2nd grade, possibly even earlier, as after this point Gypsy was homeschooled by DeeDee. DeeDee claimed this was to provide around-the-clock care for her illnesses that were so severe. However, this was later believed that this was to be an attempt to isolate Gypsy further and to continue the abuse. Gypsy's father Rod eventually remarried, and I think it hit DeeDee harder than it should have, because once again, like she did when she couldn't get Rod back in the first place, she ran away, now living with her father and stepmother. Whilst there, more suspicious claims arose about DeeDee's behaviour. During her time living with her father, DeeDee's stepmother seemed to be plagued by chronic illness. The couple claimed that whilst DeeDee was preparing food for her stepmother, she had put a weed killer in as a means to slowly poison the woman and keep her sick. Despite her manipulative tactics and pathological need to lie for attention, DeeDee couldn't stay out of trouble. She got arrested for a few minor offences, the main one being writing bad cheques. Now under suspicion by the police and her family, she began to question DeeDee's treatment of Gypsy Rose. Feeling like the cracks were beginning to show once again, DeeDee moved herself and her daughter to a suburb in New Orleans. In Slidell, she and Gypsy lived in public housing. They paid their bills with Rod's child support payments and public assistance DeeDee had been granted due to her daughter's supposed medical conditions. They saw various specialists, mostly at Tulane Medical Center and the Children's Hospital of New Orleans, seeking treatment for the illnesses DeeDee claimed Gypsy had, which now included hearing and vision problems. Whilst a muscle biopsy found no sign of the muscular dystrophy DeeDee insisted Gypsy had, she was successful in securing treatment for Gypsy's other proposed issues. After she told doctors Gypsy had seizures every few months, they prescribed anti-seizure medication. Several surgeries were performed on her during this time, and Dee Dee regularly took Gypsy to the emergency room for minor ailments. Hurricane Katrina devastated the area in August of 2005. Dee Dee and Gypsy left their ruined apartment for a shelter in Covington set up by people for special needs. Dee Dee said Gypsy's medical records, including her birth certificate, had been destroyed in the flooding. However, this was not true. It gave her the perfect cover to convince more doctors that she was in fact as sick as Dee Dee said she was. A doctor there from the Ozarks suggested they relocate to her native Missouri, and the next month they were airlifted there. At first, Dee Dee and Gypsy lived in a rented home in Aurora in southwestern Missouri. During their time there, Gypsy was honoured by the Oli Foundation, which advocates for the rights for feeding tube recipients, and in 2007, Child of the Year. In 2008, Habitats for Humanity built them a small home with a wheelchair ramp and hot tubs as part of a larger project on the north side of Springfield to the east, and the two moved there. The story of a single mother with a severely disabled daughter forced to flee Katrina's devastation received considerable local media attention, and the community often pitched in to help the woman in need. The outpouring of support included many charitable contributions. In Louisiana, the mother and daughter had at most availed themselves of occasional stays in Ronald McDonald houses during medical appointments. In Missouri, they received free flights to see doctors at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, free trips to Walt Disney World, and backstage passes to Miranda Lambert concerts by the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Rod continued to make monthly child support payments of $1,200, as well as sending Gypsy gifts and occasionally talking to her on the phone. During one call on her 18th birthday, he recalled that Dee Dee told him not to mention their daughter's real age since she thinks she's 14. Rod and his second wife hoped to get to Springfield and visit, but for a variety of reasons, Dee Dee kept continuously changing plans. She told her neighbours in Springfield that Gypsy Rose's father was an abusive drug addict and alcoholic who had never come to terms with his daughter's health issues and never sent them any money. Many people who met Gypsy were charmed by her. Her 5-foot-high, nearly toothless mouth, large glasses, and high, childlike voice reinforced the perception that she had all the problems her mother claimed she did. Dee Dee regularly shaved Gypsy's head to mimic the hairless appearance of a chemotherapy patient, allegedly telling Gypsy that since her medication would eventually cause her hair to fall out, it was best to shave it off in advance. Gypsy often wore wigs or hats to cover her baldness when they left the house. Bernardo Flasterstein, a paediatric neurologist who saw Gypsy in Springfield, became suspicious of her muscular dystrophy diagnosis. He ordered MRIs and blood tests which found no abnormalities. Flasterstein noted that Dee Dee was not a good historian. After contacting Gypsy's doctors in New Orleans, he learned that Gypsy's original muscular biopsy had come back negative, undermining Dee Dee's reported diagnosis of muscular dystrophy, as well as her claim that Gypsy's records had been destroyed by flooding. He suspected the possibility of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Dee Dee contrived to gain access to Flasterstein's notes and subsequently stopped taking Gypsy to see him. Flasterstein did not follow up by reporting Dee Dee to social services. He said another doctor had told him to treat the pair with golden gloves and doubted the authorities would believe him anyway. In 2009, an anonymous caller told the police about Dee Dee's use of different names and birth dates for herself and her daughter, and suggested Gypsy was in better health than they claimed. Officers who performed the resulting wellness check accepted Dee Dee's explanation that she used the misinformation to make it harder for her abusive ex-husband to find her and Gypsy. Without talking to Rod and reporting that Gypsy seemed genuinely mentally disabled, the file was closed. Gypsy had tried to escape for some normality at one point before the events of today's case. Since 2001, Gypsy had been attending science fiction and fantasy conventions, sometimes in costume, since she could blend into their diverse, inclusive communities in her wheelchair. At a 2011 event, she made what may have been an escape attempt that ended with her mother finding her in a hotel room with a man she'd met online. Again, Dee Dee produced paperwork giving Gypsy's false, younger birthday and threatened to inform the police. Gypsy recalls that afterwards, Dee Dee slammed her computer with a hammer and threatened to do the same to her fingers if she ever tried to escape again. She also kept Gypsy leashed and handcuffed to her bed for 2 weeks. Dee Dee later told Gypsy that she had filed paperwork with the police claiming that Gypsy was mentally incompetent, leading Gypsy to believe that she attempted to go to the police for help, they would not believe her. Sometime around 2012, Gypsy continued to use the internet after her mother had gone to bed to avoid her tightened supervision, made contact with Nicholas Godejohn, a man around her age in Big Bend, Wisconsin, whom she said she met on a Christian singles website. Godejohn had a criminal record for indecent exposure and a history of mental illness. Sometimes reported as dissociative identity disorder, he also had autism spectrum disorder. In 2014, Gypsy confided to 23-year-old neighbour Aaliyah Woodsmansey, who, unaware that Gypsy had closer to her own age considered herself a big sister, that she and Godejohn had discussed eloping and had even chosen names for potential children. Gypsy, who had 5 separate Facebook accounts, and Godejohn flirted online, their exchanges sometimes using BDSM elements, which Gypsy had since claimed was more what he was interested in. Woodmansey tried to talk her out of it, still thinking Gypsy was too young and possibly being taken advantage of by a sexual predator. She considered Gypsy's plan just fantasies and dreams, and nothing like that would ever really take place. Despite Dee Dee's efforts to prevent her from using the internet, which went as far as destroying her daughter's phone and laptop, Gypsy maintained contact with Woodmansey, who saved printouts of her post until 2014. The next year, Gypsy arranged and also paid for Godejohn to meet her mother in Springfield. Her plan was for him to just casually bump into her while she and Dee Dee went to a movie theatre, both of them in costume, and apparently strike up a conversation that way, and then later for her to introduce him to her mother. As soon as they did meet in person for the first time, Godejohn said Gypsy led him to the bathroom where the two had sex. The two continued their internet interactions and began developing their plan to kill Dee Dee. Godejohn returned to Springfield in June of 2015, arriving whilst Gypsy and her mother were away at a doctor's appointment. After they had returned home and Dee Dee had gone to sleep, he went to the Blanchard house. Gypsy let him in and allegedly gave him duct tape, gloves and a knife, with the understanding that he would use them to murder Dee Dee. They fled to a motel outside Springfield, where they stayed for a few days whilst planning their next move. During that time, they were seen on security cameras at several stores. Gypsy said at that point she believed the two had gotten away with the crime. They mailed the murder weapon back to Godejohn's home in Wisconsin to avoid being caught with it. They took a bus there. Several witnesses who saw the pair on their way to the Greyhound station noted that Gypsy wore a blonde wig and walked unassisted. After seeing concerning Facebook statuses posted from Dee Dee's account, the Blanchard friends suspected something was amiss. When phone calls went unanswered, several friends and neighbours went to the house. Whilst the friends and neighbours knew that the two often left for medical trips unannounced, they saw Dee Dee's modified car still in the driveway, making an unannounced trip like this was mostly unlikely. Protective film on the windows made it hard to see inside in the low light. No one answered the door, so the gathered friends called 911. When the police arrived, they had to wait for a search warrant to be issued before they could enter, but they allowed one of the neighbours present to climb through a window. When he saw what the inside house was largely undisturbed and that Gypsy's wheelchair was still present. When the warrant was issued, police entered the house and found Dee Dee's body. A GoFundMe account was set up to pay for her funeral expenses and possibly Gypsy's. All who knew the Blanchards feared the worst. Even if Gypsy had not been harmed, they believed she would be helpless without her wheelchair, medications, and support equipment like the oxygen tanks and feeding tubes. Woodmansey, who was amongst those gathered at the Blanchard lawn, told police what she knew about Gypsy and her secret boyfriend. She showed them the printouts she had saved, which included his name. Based on that information, police asked Facebook to trace the IP addresses for which the posts of Dee Dee's account had been made. It turned out to be in Wisconsin. The next day, police agencies in Waukesha County raided the Godejohn's Big Bend home. Godejohn and Gypsy surrendered and were taken into custody, on charges of murder and felony armed criminal action. The news that Gypsy was safe was greeted with relief in Springfield, where she and Godejohn were soon extradited and held on a $1 million bond. But in announcing the news, Greene County Sheriff Jim Arnott warned, "Things are not always what they appear." The media in Springfield soon reported the truth of the Blanchards' lives, that Gypsy had never been sick and had always been able to walk, but her mother had made her pretend otherwise, using physical abuse to control her. Arnott urged people not to donate money to the family until investigations learned the extent of the fraud. After the disclosure of how Dee Dee had treated Gypsy, sympathy for her and the victim of a violent murder rapidly shifted to her daughter as a long-term victim of child abuse. While the charge of first-degree murder can carry the death penalty under Missouri law or life without parole, County Prosecutor Dan Patterson announced he would not seek for either for Gypsy or Godejohn, calling the case extraordinary and unusual. After her attorney obtained her medical records from Louisiana, he secured a plea bargain for second-degree murder for Gypsy. Gypsy was so undernourished up to this point during the years she had been in county jail. Her lawyer said that she had gained 14 pounds in contrast to most of her clients who typically lost weight in the situation. In July of 2016, she accepted the plea bargain and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Godejohn still faced the most severe charge because prosecutors contended that he initiated the murder plot, and he and Gypsy agreed that he was the one who killed Dee Dee. He was also more severely prosecuted due to the different personal circumstances. Godejohn was granted less sympathy and understanding due to their lack of involvement in the abuse. Gypsy's plea bargain agreement did not require her to testify against him. In January 2017, his trial was postponed when prosecutors requested a second psychiatric exam. His lawyer contended that he had an intelligence quotient of 82 and is on the autism spectrum, suggesting that he had diminished capacity. He initially waived his right to a trial by jury, but changed his mind in June of that year. In December 2017, the judge set Godejohn's trial for November of 2018. In the opening statement, prosecutors alleged that Godejohn had deliberated for over a year before the crime, while his lawyer pointed to his autism and said that Gypsy had formulated the crime and their love-struck client had just gone and done as he had been asked. The next day, prosecutors showed jurors the text messages, sometimes sexually explicit, that Gypsy and Godejohn shared the week before the murder, often using various personas as well as the knife he had used to commit the murder. In some of the texts, he asked her for details about Dee Dee's room and sleeping habits. These were supplemented by video on his interview with police after his arrest, while he admitted to killing her. Gypsy testified on the trial's third day. She said that while she had indeed suggested to Godejohn that he kill Dee Dee to end her mother's abuse, she had also considered getting pregnant by him in the hope that once she was carrying Godejohn's child, Dee Dee would have to accept him. Along with the knife that she gave Godejohn, she stole baby clothes from Walmart during a shopping trip so she could go ahead with either plan. However, she said Godejohn never told her what he thought of the pregnancy plan. After 4 days, the case was sent to the jury. Jurors had the option of finding Godejohn guilty of one of 3 murder charges: involuntary manslaughter, second-degree or first-degree murder, or not guilty of any of them. After approximately 2 hours of deliberation, they returned with the verdict, and Godejohn was found guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. In February of 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison for the murder's conviction, the only possible option since prosecutors had declined to seek the death penalty. Godejohn asked Judge David Jones for leniency on the armed criminal action charge, which carried a minimum sentence of only 3 years, saying he had fallen blindly in love with Gypsy. He received a sentence of 25 years on that charge, which is concurrent with the life sentence. Jones also denied a motion by Godejohn's lawyer, Dwayne Perry, for a new trial. Perry argued that the jury should not have been allowed to hear that Godejohn had considered raping Dee Dee on the night of the murder, and also argued that the state's psychologist should not have been allowed to testify, while Godejohn's psychologist should have to establish that he had. Dee Dee's family in Louisiana, who had confronted her about her treatment of Gypsy years before, did not mourn her. Her father, stepmother and nephew, who first shared details of Gypsy's actual health when she first started using a wheelchair, all later said that Dee Dee deserved her fate and the Gypsy had been punished as much as she needed to be. None of them would pay for her funeral, and her father and stepmother flushed the ashes down the toilet. Rod Blanchard, Gypsy's father, was more forgiving. He stated in an interview with BuzzFeed, "I think Dee Dee's problem was that she started a web of lies and there was no escaping it. It was like a tornado got started. He was happy the first time he saw Gypsy walking under her own power." Upon reflecting on her time in prison, Gypsy said, "I feel like I'm more free in prison than I was living with my mum, because now I'm allowed to just live like a normal woman. Gypsy also stated in an interview with BuzzFeed reporter Michelle Dean that she'd been able to research Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now known as factitious disorder imposed on another, on prison computers, and her mother had every symptom. "I think she would have been the perfect mum for someone who was actually sick," she said. Gypsy had always hoped the doctors would see through the ruse her mother had created, and she was frustrated that none besides Vlasterstein did. When asked what made her want to escape her situation, Gypsy recalled the 2011 incident at the science fiction convention. It made her wonder why she was not allowed to have friends like other people her age. While she said that Godejohn took her idle discussions as murder into reality, she accepts that she committed a crime and has to live with the consequences. Nonetheless, she has said she hopes to help other abuse victims. Despite being in prison, Gypsy Rose managed to find love, meeting her now husband, Ryan Scott Anderson, whom she married on June 27th of 2022. On September 29th, 2023, the Missouri Department of Corrections confirmed that Gypsy had been granted parole, and she was released on December 28th of 2023 after serving 85% of her sentence per state law. This is the story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her mother, DeeDee Blanchard. As much as I do not agree with the way in which the events unfolded within this story, I do feel like Gypsy was as much a victim as she was a willing participant in the murder. And although she served 8 of her 10-year sentence, I do feel like justice has been served and she deserves a second chance to now live her life the way she's going to live it. So if you managed to stay this long, I want to say thank you. If you want to see more content like this, then please subscribe so you don't miss out on any future uploads. Thank you so much for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.